question to start out with is that the Supreme Court decided that sexual harassment was illegal under sex discrimination laws in 1986. Why is it still a problem?
I think that first, when we talk about the existing sexual harassment laws that are on the books, it's really important for us to talk about the fact that there are many people who actually aren't covered when it comes to experiencing sexual harassment and being able to receive a remedy for that harassment. And so when we think about the problem of why sexual harassment exists, we have to talk about the fact that there are workers like farm workers, domestic workers, and small employees who have essentially not had any protection against harassment for years and years.
And that's because they're not covered by the law.
That's right. The law excludes them. And that is a problem when we have whole groups of people who aren't covered, because then that creates a situation in which there's a climate where certain people's lives and work matter and are protected and certain people aren't. And when you talk about sexual harassment and the prevalence of it today, we have to talk about the culture that's required in order to end it. And if we have a legal system in which certain workers essentially can be harassed with no protection, that creates a climate in which we say that we aren't really serious about ending it. And so there have been many people who've come forward over the years to bring sexual harassment claims who are covered by the law. But unfortunately, because they aren't entitled to sufficient remedies under the law, because of the way that the damages are calculated, because we as a country still haven't really taken on sexual harassment as a serious health and safety issue, which it is, and because there are not adequate programs in place to actually be able to teach workers about their rights or to provide training to people about what to do if their rights have been violated. I think it's all of those conditions together that make sexual harassment a huge problem that it is today, despite the fact that the law was passed in 1986.
So you've been very involved in legislative efforts to actually correct and improve the law, particularly the recent Be Heard legislation. Could you talk a little bit about that? How would that change the law to provide more protections?
As I mentioned, there are workers who aren't covered by our existing federal law, and that is because right now there's a threshold under the law that requires there be 15 workers or more in order to get protection against sexual harassment. So if you're someone who works in a place that has 14 workers or fewer, that means you could be sexually harassed and under a federal law not receive protection. Currently, the law requires that damages in a sexual harassment case be determined not based on the pain and suffering of the person, but based on the number of employees that they work with. And one of the other major things that's included in our existing framework is that there's a very short period of time that people have to report. So it's 180 days under federal law, and if there's a state law in the place where the person lives or works, it's 300 days. But 180 days or 300 days, those are very short periods of time. So three of the specific things that the Be Heard Act would do is it would take the threshold for employees who are covered from 15 workers to 1. So basically, if you're a person who's working, including independent contractors and interns, you'd be covered under this new law. And if you were sexually harassed, you'd be able to receive protection under that law. Damages would be calculated not based on the number of people that you work with, but would be based on the pain and suffering of the person. And the time limitation for filing a charge of discrimination or for bringing a complaint for discrimination, including sexual harassment, would be extended from 180 days or 300 days to 4 years. Those are just a few of the things. I mean, the Be Heard Act actually is very robust. It would provide workers who are LGBTQI with additional rights. And essentially what we want to make sure happens is that when we talk about ending sexual harassment or any form of harassment against workers, we're talking about all workers in all workplaces. And there's a chance that could happen with this law.
One of the other parts of the law, my understanding is, and something that you've been very involved in, is the notion that even if the rights exist on paper, even if the rights exist in the court, someone has to have access to legal services to be able to enforce those rights.
That's
right.
So
can you talk a little bit about that, what you have done or what you see the remedy for expanding that access?
Sure. So, one of the big barriers, particularly if someone is a low-paid worker, if they're an immigrant worker, if they're a non-English speaking worker, there's a real barrier to justice because people don't know what their rights are. And if they do learn what their rights are, they don't know how to find legal help in order to bring a case. So two of the things that the Be Heard Act would do would be to provide additional training and resources to employers of all sizes so that workers can be better informed about what their rights are. And then it actually would provide for some grants that would be available to provide legal services and other kinds of services to survivors of workplace sexual violence.
So we have talked a lot in our class, and you talk a lot. Anyone who works in the sexual harassment field knows that sexual harassment is not just about sexual behavior. It's part of a pattern of a larger discrimination against workers and against women on a lot of fronts. It's also something that's very important to have legal protections about, but we cannot rely only on legal protection. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of structural and cultural changes need to be focused on to improve the situation for workers around sexual harassment issues?
When a lot of people who are familiar with my work think about my work, they think of it really only from the enforcement side and the accountability side. And both enforcement and accountability are important, but if we don't have the culture shift that's required, then actually having a law on the books means very little, in my opinion. And the way that we're going to get to a place where we have sexual harassment-free zones is by actually achieving a shift in the way that employment, places of employment function and the climate that exists at those places of employment. So, right now, when you look at the type of training that exists at workplaces, they often tell people that if you've been harassed or discriminated in any way, you can come forward, make a report to your HR representative, and then action will be taken. But we really need to shift things so that there's more a carrot rather than a stick, so that if other coworkers see that there's a problem, that they can be empowered to help report that so that the environment is safe. Right? We need to change it so that we don't view sexual harassment protections or other kinds of discrimination rights as something that's punitive, as opposed to something that's actually about making the workplace safe and better for everyone to be able to reach their potential, right? I think we have to shift things so that employers understand that these laws are actually for the benefit not just of the workers, but also of the employer, because if someone feels safe at work, they can actually reach their full potential in the workplace. And that's an environmental change that we have to work toward. But the other thing that we have to work toward, in my opinion, is en masse, as we receive information about sexual harassment, when we hear about the stories of people coming forward, how are they being portrayed in the media? Who's talking about their experience? Is the survivor having the opportunity to share their experience and what their hopes are for what changes can be made? And then also what kind of film and TV are we consuming? And when there's a TV show, for example, that talks about sexual harassment training, as has been done in the past, are they talking about sexual harassment training in a comedic way? Are they making fun of that training? Or are they talking about it as in a serious way that encourages people to come forward? So in order for us to actually, in my opinion, reach a point where workers can be safe from sexual harassment or any other form of harassment, we have to have a culture shift in the workplace so that employers are inviting people to disclose, to be upstanders, and to take measures in order to prevent the harassment from happening in the first place. And we also have to have a societal shift where we as a country and community are talking about sexual harassment in a way that encourages people to talk about what's happened to them, and one that encourages swift action when there's a problem that's been recognized.
All right, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the legal system or the culture around these issues, what would it be? What one action would you?
That's hard. That's a hard question.
Doesn't have to be the only one. What would you like anyone looking at this video to be working towards tomorrow, starting today or tomorrow?
I want all of us to be working towards a situation in which people know that when they come forward that they'll be believed. Because knowing that you will be believed as opposed to judged or questioned or ridiculed will actually go a long way, I think, for helping to change the way that we respond, and also will go a long way in terms of preventing the problem. Because at the end of the day, I've worked on this issue for over 2 decades. And at the end of the day, I think that those of us who are doing this work, we really want to work ourselves out of business. We'd like to see the day where this problem doesn't exist anymore. And that's going to happen when we actually embrace the fact that when people are coming forward, They're sharing one of the most difficult things that's ever happened to them in their lives, and we believe them, and we want to work with them towards a solution.